Hello, everyone. Hey, it's great to see you. I'm so glad that we can be together. Jolene Boomquo is the Belgian national champion in the shot put and hammer throw, but that is not why she is a hero in Belgium. Unfortunately, in her event, she finished only 7th place in a recent competition. However, when her team's hurdlers both went down with injuries, Jolene literally stepped up to run the event. Did she win? Not even close. Was she surprisingly good? No. As her competitors sprinted down the track and cleared the hurdles like gazelles, Jolene slowly jogged up to each hurdle and carefully stepped over to avoid tripping and hurting herself. However, because her team participated in the event, it received 2 points. And those 2 points allowed them to avoid elimination and to continue competing. And Jolene concluded that it was more important for her team to advance than it was for her to avoid an embarrassing performance. So for one race, she nearly crawled over hurdles to collect enough points for the team to continue competing. And impressively, she was all smiles both before and after the race. Jolene has grit. Some of the grittiest people in the Bible are women. So today I want us to remember the person that I think of as the queen of grit. Her name is Esther. And there are 2 books in the Old Testament that are named after women. One is Ruth. The other is the book of Esther, which never mentions God by name, but has God's fingerprints all over it. The book of Esther reminds us that even when God works in the shadows, he does good work. A friend of mine says that the characters in the book of Esther remind him of playing cards. So I'm going to use that analogy to help us remember the characters and this compelling drama that includes them. The king in the book of Esther is named Xerxes, and he is the ruler over all of Persia. And Xerxes is not a figurehead or ceremonial king. He is an actual king with real authority, almost ultimate authority, and he held the power of life and death in his hands. The book of Esther has a queen also. Actually, it begins with one queen whose name is Vashti, whom we can think of as the Queen of Diamonds. But there is also a Queen of Hearts in the story who is Esther herself. And as the story unfolds, Esther becomes the woman who holds the heart of King Xerxes, which she could have used to her own benefit, which many people would have. But Esther was challenged to use this relationship and this access for others, and we're going to see how she responded. Now, in a deck of playing cards, there is a spoiler in many games. Do you know what that card is? It's the Joker. And in some card games, the Joker is wild and can be an advantage to a player, but in other games, the Joker is wild in a different sense and is a card to avoid. In the book of Esther, there is a Joker, not because he is funny, not because he is entertaining, but because he hates and he ridicules the Jewish people. The Joker's name is Haman, and he is a truly despicable person, as we're going to see. And then finally, there is Mordecai, and you could say he is the ace. Mordecai is the ace in the hole that God uses to disrupt Haman's maniacal plan to destroy God's people. Now, this Persian empire of Xerxes was absolutely massive. It stretched from parts of northern Africa and modern-day Greece to the west to parts of India in the east. Nearly half the shoreline of the Mediterranean Sea was under Persian control. Xerxes was a powerful ruler, and he liked to remind people that he was a very big deal. In the 3rd year of his reign, Xerxes threw an epic party. The event was designed to impress his allies, to intimidate his enemies, and to promote his war efforts. And the party was scheduled to last not a week and not even a month. The party was scheduled to last for 180 days. Ever been to a 180-day party? Imagine how expensive it would be to host a 6-month-long feast. And after 6 months, the king said, I'm not ready to send everyone home yet. Let's keep it going. Let's go one more week. So this already excessive party goes into party overtime. Well, let's read Esther 1, verse 10. On the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him. Now, we'll finish that thought in a moment, but when it says the 7th day, it's referring to the 7th day of the 1-week extension. Altogether, this is the 187th day. And at this point, it had become a lifestyle, and Xerxes was running out of ways to top the entertainment that he had offered the previous day. So what did he order his staff to do? Look at verse 11, and we'll finish the thought. He told them to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. Well, apparently the queen was fed up with Xerxes and his partying friends. And she knew that the king wanted his inebriated friends to leer at her and to lust after her, so she refused to make an appearance. And this embarrassed Xerxes in front of his subjects and his officials. But instead of apologizing for what he was asking from her, he retaliated against her by banishing Vashti from the kingdom. Well, after some time passed, Xerxes regretted his harsh response to the queen. He was facing military and political problems. He longed for the comfort that a wife could offer. He had a harem, but quantity cannot replace quality when it comes to intimacy. So the king's advisors proposed a plan. They proposed a beauty pageant, the winner of which would become the new wife of the queen. That's exactly what a bunch of dudes would suggest to the king, right? And they probably called it The Bachelor BC. I don't know if you've seen that online, but I think it was the original. And this is where God begins to do what only God can do, working his will through people who know him and working out his will through people who do not acknowledge him. Look at Esther 2, verse 7. A man named Mordecai had a very beautiful and lovely young cousin, Hadassah, who was also called Esther. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her into his family and raised her as his own daughter. As a result of the king's decree, Esther, along with many other young women, was brought to the king's harem at the fortress of Susa. Now, there are a lot of moral and theological questions that could be asked about those words and about Mordecai. Why would he want this for his cousin who's now his adopted daughter? Did God reveal to Mordecai that he had a unique plan for Esther and that this was part of it? You know, the Bible often leaves questions like this unanswered. In many cases, the Bible records what people did, but it doesn't record what God thinks of what they did or what they should have done. All we know is that Esther caught the attention of those who were searching for a beautiful bride for the king, and she entered the process. Was Esther afraid? Did she have moral reservations? We don't know. We do know, however, that before Esther was allowed to appear before the king, she underwent 12 months of beauty treatments. Now, I am not an expert on how much time beauty treatments should take, but that seems like a long time. Men, if you have ever waited for the woman in your life to finish getting ready for a date, no matter how long it took, I'll bet you feel better about it now, don't you? Because anything under 12 months is not so bad. But here's the kicker. No one realizes that Esther is Jewish. Her parents are dead. Her extended family have lived in Babylon, which is now Persia, for so long, the branches on the family tree are becoming obscure. Persia was a melting pot, but it will soon become very significant that a young Jewish woman is among the group from which the king is going to choose a wife. Well, in time, the king meets Esther, and he chooses her to become his queen. And in the lower earthly storyline, it was likely because Esther was beautiful and had a winsome personality. In the upper heavenly storyline, it was because God was using her beauty to position her for an important task. And friends, this is a good reminder that whatever positive trait God has given you, He wants you to use it for Him, whatever it is. There are a lot of people who have the same advantage that Esther was given, physical attraction. And yet many people do not seem to realize that such qualities, beauty, handsomeness, whatever it is, those things are not distributed by God for our indulgence. They are distributed so that they can be used for the good of others. If your talent or your appearance or your personality is the kind that opens doors for you, friend, you should ask God what He wants you to carry through those doors. We've discussed this before. Your gifts, whether they're spiritual or physical, your gifts are not primarily for you, they are for others. King Xerxes and Esther marry. Their wedding day is declared a national holiday, but the king has no clue that his lovely new wife is Jewish, because as urged by her uncle Mordecai, her adopted father, Esther has not told a soul that she is a Jew. Now, one thing I love about the book of Esther is that it reveals how God can weave together seemingly unrelated events. For example, one day at the city gate, Esther's older cousin Mordecai overhears two palace guards discussing an assassination plot against King Xerxes. So Mordecai sends a message to Queen Esther, who in turn tells the king's security detail. And they look into it, they corroborate the story, and the conspirators are executed. And the scribe who records all the things that happen in the king's daily activities makes a very small note that a man named Mordecai reported a plot against the king and saved the king's life. And that seems like one of 1,000 details that might be buried in the annals of the king, perhaps never to be read again. However, during a sleepless night in the future, the king would run across that footnote and he would finally seek to reward Mordecai without knowing that Mordecai was the older cousin of his wife. And this would set Mordecai and the villain Haman on a collision course that God would ultimately use for His purposes. You know, it's easy to assume that you and I have nothing in common with the villains that we see in the stories that we read, whether they're in the Bible or in movies or in television. But I want us to talk about Haman for a moment. When people are elevated to higher positions, when you or I are elevated to a higher position, it always reveals something about our character. Haman was a self-obsessed power addict. So after the king promoted him to the most powerful person in the land, aside from the king, then Haman began to demand excessive acts of respect and gestures of respect from everyone. He expected every person that he encountered to bow down to him. And fearing Haman's power, almost everyone did what Haman demanded. Everyone except a guy named Mordecai. And Mordecai's faith in God would not allow him to treat Haman like a god or to cower before Haman because he was to fear God alone. And Haman hated Mordecai for that. Haman fantasized about how he would take revenge on Mordecai. And Haman thought, I have to put Mordecai to death. I need to see him die. But he did not stop there. Look at verse 6 of Esther 3. Haman learned of Mordecai's nationality. So he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Haman had the spirit of Hitler long before Hitler. He devised a scheme to wipe out the Jews in the entire empire. So Haman went to King Xerxes And he described the Jews as loyal and disruptive and evil. And he said to the king, "King, I have a proposal. I will make a generous donation to the king's treasury if you will sign a decree that schedules an annihilation date for the Jewish people. After all, these people are doing you no good." And while King Xerxes refuses the financial gift, he fails to discern what an evil thing Haman is up to, and not realizing that his wife is one of those Jewish people. He callously allows Haman to proceed. Now, if you had been a Jewish person living in Persia at this time, you very likely would have been tempted to think, God has totally forgotten us. God has completely abandoned us. But that was not the case. God was there in a pagan nation, keeping watch over his people. So friend, even when God is out of sight, he is never out of business. As Hebrews 13:5 promises, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. That is God's promise. But all of us can understand how the Jews in Persia would have wondered if that was still true for them. Well, Mordecai, Esther's uncle, hears about Haman's evil plot before Esther hears about it. And he begins to mourn, but he also sends a message to Esther asking for her help. And Esther replies, "Mordecai, I'd love to do something, but you don't understand. The king has not summoned me for weeks. He may not even want to see me. And in case you have forgotten the law, if I show up in the king's presence uninvited and he does not want to welcome my visit, I could die." I mean, do you remember what the king did to my predecessor, the previous queen? Now, some people would have been tempted to reply to Esther, "Okay, well, I understand, Esther. You need to watch out for yourself. We'll all just pray and hope for the best." But Mordecai knew that God's providence had placed Esther where she was at that time. He knew everything was on the line for tens of thousands of Jewish people. It was a literal do or die moment. Look at Esther 4, verse 13. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther: "Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this?" When someone needs to do something, we all need to ask if we are the someone that God is calling to do something. You know, some of you work in an environment that is not healthy. Some of you are part of a broken family. Some of you are caught between alienated friends who haven't spoken in years. Some of you belong to a circle of parents where there is criticism and gossip that have become the norm, and where leaders of one organization or another are castigated. And so far, you've done exactly nothing to right the wrong. And perhaps you've even thought, well, it's time for me to get out of this. But maybe it's not time for you to get out. Maybe it's time for you to go further in. Maybe it's time for you to stop preserving yourself and risking the opportunity and the rapport that God has given you for something that is greater than you. Sometimes God does want you to escape an unhealthy environment, to avoid unhealthy people. The Bible teaches this principle, but it has a context. And before you leave that context, you need to ask God if he has an assignment for you. Sometimes God allows us to be in difficult circumstances so we can bring the hope and the direction people need. And maybe that is why you are finding yourself in an awkward set of circumstances right now, because God has placed you, like Esther, there for such a time as this. Mordecai told his young cousin, who is really more like his niece, and again, is his adopted daughter. Esther, this is why God elevated you from an orphan to the queen. God orchestrated all of this to position you to save his people. Friend, you and I need to remember that our influence in this world is kind of like the money in a Monopoly game. When the game is over, it all goes back in the box. You are not going to take your influence with you. So why not put it on the line and use it while you are here? Why not risk it for something good that needs to happen? Now, can people misapply this principle? Can people do selfish things in the name of noble things? Happens all the time. But if God is calling you to do something, maybe he has placed you in the circumstances in which you find yourself for just such a time as this. So if you're in a relationship, if you are in a department at work, if you are in a school, if you are in a small group at church, if you are in a circle of friends or a circle of parents where you feel caught in the middle, maybe it is time for you to get out of the middle. And maybe you are the instrument God wants to use to help set things right. What if you've been appointed for such a time as this and you do nothing? How do you know the someone who is needed is someone else? What if God is looking to you? Well, Esther faced all these questions, and she was fortunate to have someone who courageously spoke God's wisdom into her life. And I love Esther's first response to this challenge, because she didn't impulsively say, yes, I'm going in to see the king right now. She knew she needed God's wisdom. She knew she needed God's help. And recognizing the magnitude of these circumstances, she sent this message back to Mordecai. In Esther 4:16, she says, go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. You want to know how a gritty person thinks and speaks? Here it is. Pray as if everything depends on God, and then do what only you are uniquely positioned to do. And stop wishing someone else would do it. Friend, there are some things only you can say because only you have the relationship and the rapport to say them. Too many people arrive at a moment like Esther's moment and refuse to step up or speak out. You probably will not have to risk death like Esther, but you may have to risk a relationship. You might have to risk a promotion. You might risk being someone's favorite person. You might risk being liked. And for some of us, being liked is the idol to which we bow down. It is the drug to which we are hopelessly addicted. We will not do or say things that might result in us not being liked. And we fail to speak the truth to our peers and our loved ones because we need to be liked by people. But what if you have been called for such a time as this and you don't need to risk your life, you just need to risk your like? Well, Esther chose to risk her life. And I'm not going to tease the narrative any further. I'll just summarize it. Xerxes receives Esther into his presence. He is very taken with her. And he offers her anything she wants, up to half his kingdom, without knowing what it was she was going to ask for. But rather than immediately blurting out her desire to see Haman's treacherous plan reversed, Esther chooses to patiently guide the scenario toward a conclusion. She invites Haman to a dinner to be given in his honor because she knows he can't resist that. And then she invites him to yet another dinner And she sets a trap that his ego and his pride simply cannot resist. What a gritty plan. And as the story winds to a conclusion, Mordecai receives a great honor that Haman had arranged for himself, and Haman is hung on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. You see, even when God chooses to work in the shadows, he does good work, and he eventually finishes his work. Friend, you should read Esther chapters 1 through 8 over the next few days. I suspect if you read chapter 1, you won't be able to put it down. You'll have to keep going. But I want to offer two applications of this story that you and I desperately need to hear and apply. Here's the first. When truth and relationship intersect, you and I need to be gritty. Esther is an amazing, gritty woman, but I do not want you to miss what her cousin, what her adopted dad, Mordecai, did. Mordecai did not say to Esther, hey girl, you're in an ideal situation. Don't blow it by trying to be some kind of hero. He encouraged her to put it all on the line for something that was beyond her and something that truly mattered. Would Esther have been the hero she was without Mordecai's encouragement and challenge? Perhaps not. Probably not. Sometimes we struggle to encourage our loved ones to go all in for God. A line from an old hymn has always stayed with me. The line in the hymn reads, "Give of thy sons to bear the message glorious." In other words, send your son, your daughter, into the fields that God wants to harvest. Now, as a young adult, I recruited students for a Bible college that trained young adults for ministry, and I frequently encountered parents who wanted the preachers and the missionaries and the church staff to be someone else's children, not their children. And to be honest, I get that to a point. I mean, I wonder how my son's financial future will unfold as he continues to work for a church. There's every indication that he will. Some of his peers from college are making 3 or 4 times what he is earning. My daughter went to an expensive Christian university on the West Coast, and she currently earns less than her annual college tuition. But she loves her work, and she is helping people find their way into God's church, and I cannot think of a better way for her to use her life. Relationships can tempt us to shift or adapt or even suppress our spiritual values. Years ago, someone confided in me that a neighbor was charged with a crime that he knew was committed by his brother. And he felt tortured by that knowledge because he had always been told and taught, family comes first, no matter what. But if you're a true follower of Jesus, where does healthy family loyalty end and loyalty to Jesus begin? 30 years ago, I saw a man step away from a decades-long friendship because his friend was on a mission to divide their church. And the man had to choose God's truth over that relationship, and it was a painful cost for him to pay. Jesus taught that our commitment to our friends and our family ends where our commitment to Him and our obligation to God begins. Look at what Jesus said. If you love your father or mother more than you love me, you are not worthy of being mine. If you love your son or daughter more than me, you are not worthy of being mine. Now, friend, what light does that cast on our frequent statements? My children mean more to me than anything or anyone. My family means more to me than anything or anyone. More than God? More than Jesus and His kingdom? This is such a challenging teaching because God's the one who teaches us to love our families and sacrifice for them and prioritize them. And look, this doesn't mean that you can't love and show grace to your friends and family, but all of us have to choose God and His truth, even if it gets awkward with our loved ones, even if someone threatens to shut us out if we will not voice agreement with something we know is wrong in God's sight. So parents, prove to your kids that God is your priority. And if you have to let them pay a temporary price in order to teach them integrity, then you do that. And spouses, be courageous and devote yourself to God first. Sometimes spouses are the only people who have access to speak a truth that the other spouse needs to hear. Children, honor your parents, but devote yourself to God first. And honor your Father in heaven above all. That is what Mordecai did. He risked his relationship with his celebrity adopted daughter in order to challenge her to answer God's call on her life. And God used his challenge to prompt her to save tens of thousands of lives. And here's a final application about that beautiful phrase that Mordecai spoke to Esther. You are always called to such a time as this. If you are alive, you've been called by God today. And if you're alive tomorrow, and for as long as you live. Here's the second application, and we need this reminder. When comfort and calling collide, it's time to be gritty. You know, a lot of good things go undone for God because the more comfortable you and I become, the less grit we seem to possess and demonstrate. And I really admire Esther for choosing her calling over her comfort. And I'm wondering, will anyone be able to admire you and admire me because we chose our calling over our comfort? It takes true grit to disregard your own comfort. I met with a church planter last week who left a church that drew thousands of people each Sunday like this church. And he left that church to plant a brand new church. At his old church, he had dozens of staff who did many of the things that he must now do for himself because the church, so young, can't afford staff to do those things. And he took a cut in pay and moved from one of the most affordable cities to one of the most expensive in the country. But God's call on his life was clear, and so he chose his calling over his comfort. And what does he have to show for it? Only this. People who would likely not know Jesus, who are surrendering their lives to Jesus. And a very cool baptistry called the Atlantic. So here's a challenge for you and me. Look for ways to say no to your own comfort this week that allow you to say yes to God. Normally, in our normal frame of mind and mode of operating, we avoid those things. This week, go looking for those things and carve out a new way of thinking and living for yourself. And we're going to remind you to do this through Westside's social media channels. And look, don't just do it once. Do it as many times as you can. Make it a lifestyle this coming week and then keep it going. After all, you were called for such a time as this.